Thanks, Brian. This is like 15 minutes of data nerd fest, so I will... so what is this? This is there's 13 co-authors across 7 different institutions. Why? Because you'll see in a minute, this is a very international data set. I'm going to give you kind of a summary, but if you're interested in the details, it's in a paper that came out actually literally like 5-6 days ago. So productivity growth in the US, believe it or not, has actually been slowing down for the last 75 years. If you go back to the 50s, US productivity growth was about 4% a year. If you look in the last 5-10 years, it's about 1%. This is a pretty pessimistic graph. In fact, I wrote a paper in 2020 talking about this that's got some traction. As you'll see in a minute, I think AI potentially is going to change this. I think AI is potentially like a once-in-a-century type of technology. I'll talk for the next kind of 50 minutes and try and persuade you that. So what is the effect of AI? There are just huge variations. So I've been an economist for 30 years. I've never seen anything with this much spread. So on one hand, you have folks like Dario Amodi, who obviously is trying to sell an AI company. So maybe that's not surprising me. He's incredibly bullish. So his predictions are it will increase GDP growth to 10 or 20%, which is like a 10-fold increase in productivity. We've never seen anything like that. On the other hand, at the kind of lower end, there's folks like Darren Acemoglu. So Darren is my friend and co-author. He won the Nobel Prize, last year? He has a much more kind of moderate prediction of 0.5% over 10 years, which is 0.05% a year, which is, to be honest, close to nothing. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office, which does government projections and figures, it's predicting 0.1%. So there's just an enormous variation. I work with a bunch of central banks, and for them, this is absolutely critical. So if you follow anything about kind of finance, budget deficits, et cetera, the difference between a 10% increase in productivity growth and a 0.1% is just extreme ends of the spectrum. So you've probably seen Kevin Warsh is about to take over as head of the Fed. He's pushing that AI is going to increase productivity growth. He's using a reason to reduce interest rates. This data is very relevant to that debate. So why did I get involved in this? Well, there's very thin data actually on forecasting the effect of productivity growth that the central banks can rely on. The problem is if you look at what's out there, there's a mix of kind of, Silicon Valley types that are very optimistic, and we heard from Workday and Box, which has been great, but is that representative of the economy? Up to folks at the other end that are super negative and complaining about slop, et cetera. So we wanted to do the first international representative survey of execs to get some information on this. So before I do that, I'll show you what we know about from other surveys, current AI use, including individuals. Then I'll talk about our survey, try and convince you it's reasonably reliable, and then go through the results. So in current data, I'm going to break it up into what we know from individuals versus what we know from firms. What we know from individuals is much better. What we know from firms is where the gap is. So for individuals, there are a number of surveys of Americans that look at how many of them regularly use AI. And the answer is it's been rising a lot. It was close to 0 before ChatGPT came out. It was released in November 2022. It is now about a third. So about a third of Americans regularly use AI. Around in Silicon Valley, it's probably 2/3, but across the whole country, it's about a third. I've been working with Gallup, who have amazing data on political affiliation, and they've been recently collecting data on AI use. Quite interestingly, there is a big political split on this. So if you look in terms of who's using AI and who's most exposed to it, there's a strong Democratic skew on this. Now, I'm not going to talk much the rest of the day on politics, but I think this is going to be a very important issue, how AI interacts with the political system. Separately, we've also been collecting data on where people are using AI, and I loved the discussion around his discussion about everyday AI. This is a technology that, unlike most other technologies, has primarily been used today outside work. This is pretty odd. If you think of the internet or computers or most other techs, they started in the workplace. The first time I used any of that was at work, and then at some point, they came cheap enough to use it at home. AI has actually started for most folks at home and moved into the workplace. So of employees, they're kind of used to it. The question is, are they using it at work? So what about firm data? So this is where things get more problematic. So probably the data, if you've seen any data, probably the data you've seen in the media is from the census. So the US Census is fantastic. If you don't know it, the census is actually enshrined in the Constitution. They're an amazing organization. I work with them a lot. But this survey I don't think is very good. So this question in particular on this survey, the BTOS survey is not bad. This question is kind of problematic. So if you look at this data chart, it is claiming that only 17.3% of American firms are currently using AI, which I think is like weirdly low. I'll come on to some other data. I just think it's too low. And B, it hasn't actually risen that much. So why might this, why might there be problems with this data? From working with the census, the folks that are responding to this question are relatively low form fillers. They're like 2 or 3 down from the CFO. And it's not obvious they actually know what's going on. So maybe someone's using it, they're just not aware of it. So we kind of, I'm going to show you, collected data across countries to try and get some hard data on firm use of AI, and particularly impact on productivity and employment. So where do we start from? There is an existing survey panel for these 4 countries run by the central bank. So in the UK, it's called the Decision Maker Panel. It's got a few thousand firms. In the US, it's the SBU, et cetera. We inserted questions into that. How does that work? Well, you start by phoning folks up. So one of the problems with these paid online surveys is you don't know who's responding. If you pay somebody $50, is it even a person or is it a bot surveying about a bot, et cetera? So we wanted to phone actual people up to make sure it is individuals, real people answering our survey. So we have this very expensive phone bank that recruits folks and has been doing this for several years. So you have a large panel of employees, that are a large panel of execs in our survey. We sample every firm at 10 plus employees. The typical firm in this sample has 250 employees. So it is not Amazon, it's not, I don't know actually if it's Workday or Box. I don't know the names, but typically they are smaller, well, 250 employees, that's a big company, but they're not massive corporations. Who do we target? We basically go after the CFO. So the most common person responding to our survey is going to be a CFO in a 250-person firm. So who are they? They're a graduate. They're probably earning $500,000 to $1 million a year. They're very quantitative, which is why we like to go after them. CEOs are the senior execs. So before I show you the results, I just want to show you our baseline data looks reasonable. If you're going to eat food, you'd want to see the ingredients perhaps before you ate something. So I've shown you the methodology, and you probably want to make sure you knew something about it, the place that was selling it. So I'm going to show you some data quality checks. I'd say in reverse, do not trust surveys where they hide their methodology and you've never heard of the company before. They tend to have amazing results, but whether they're true is a very different matter. So here is our data. We've been running these surveys for 10 years, not about AI, just about other stuff. For the US firms at the top, the UK firms at the bottom, you can see it tracks GDP, that's the left panel, and employment growth, the right panel, very well. So, it tracks the drop in the COVID pandemic recession, the rebound, the overshoot, et cetera. Suffice to say, we have a large enough and big enough sample that we can track the overall economy, we're representative, et cetera. The other thing we do is we've asked CEOs, CFOs, et cetera, over the last 10 years to predict ahead. So these folks are good at making forecasts. They run their companies. They know what's going on. We've asked them for many years to predict sales growth and employment growth. What do you see? You see they do a pretty good job because we get their accounts a year and a half later. We can see what actually turned out. And it's not perfect. The pandemic happened. If you're in Britain, Brexit happened. Trump tariffs happened, et cetera. But overall, they're pretty good. So at this point, what do we find in the results? Well, I'm now going to show you what they tell about AI. So the first thing we do is we ask a question about them themselves. If there's one person you'd know best about, it's yourself. So, do you yourself use AI? So this is, to put this in context again, this is senior execs, CFOs, CEOs of on average, pretty big companies, 250-person companies. Their probably turnovers kind of 10, 20, $30 million a year type. One quarter just never use it at all. So on the left, not at all. The black bar is all companies, then light blue is the US, red is the UK, purple is Germany, and then green is Australia. So one quarter don't use it. About 40% of senior execs are using about an hour a week. About 25% or a quarter using it 1 to 5, and just under 10% are more than 5 hours a week. Is this a high or a low number? It depends massively on who you talk to. So if I talk to my undergrads, this seems an outrageously low number. They're claiming to use it many hours a week, and that's to a professor, and they're nervous about, I think, grading in AI, so there's probably twice what they claim. On the other hand, just to be very clear, for a new technology, this is epically fast adoption rates. If you look at cell phones, computers, broadband, pretty much anything, have a 75% adoption rate within effectively 3 years of public use is an incredibly high adoption rate. On the right, you can see the average number. The average senior exec in the US is using AI for about 1.5 hours a week. And that sounds about right. You know, I'm 52, the kind of, you know, my kids' friends, parents, my friends, that's the kind of numbers I hear outside of tech. I know in tech land it's very different, but these are mostly not tech firms. They're mostly retail, healthcare, manufacturing, et cetera. In terms of their firms, similar numbers. About a quarter of firms are not using AI at all. They're not formally using it. The execs, I mean, they may be implicitly, but as far as their policy is not to use it, 3/4 are. If you look at the far left, interestingly, you see the US in light blue has the highest adoption rate. UK, my homeland, is like second. Germany and Australia are behind. It's perhaps not surprising. America is very much at the frontier of this. It's kind of pioneering use. Use is spreading behind. If we were to have data on South America, Asia, Africa, it would probably look lower. But in all cases, it's rising very quickly. So, you know, adoption rates, particularly in America, are extremely high. Who is adopting AI? So we can match this up to company accounts. Top left, you look at labor productivity, so sales per employee. On the x-axis is labor productivity. On the y-axis is AI use. The upward slope tells you that highly productive firms are using it more. Middle axis, bigger firms are using it more. Right axis, higher paid firms are using it more. Think of higher educated. Perhaps more interestingly, there's a very strong relationship with being young. So we know the age of the directors. We know the age of the firm. Younger firms are using it massively more than older firms. Okay, so far so good. In some senses, this is what you might expect. So perhaps, you know, the most interesting stuff, we ask firms about the past and future impact of AI. And particularly future interesting, I think this is probably the best prediction you can get. Why? This is thousands upon thousands of leaders of companies who are actually putting it in on a day-to-day basis. When you talk about AI, it has amazing potential. The big challenge is the bottlenecks, the obstacles. Can it be used? Well, this is thousands of people actually paying for it, making decisions across the economy. So what do we find? So firstly, looking back over the last 3 years, it has frankly had not much impact on productivity. So if you look, 90% of firms are saying it's had no impact at all. There are some saying it has a small impact. You know, tech firms are probably many of them that are sad in that. But overall, if you go to the right graph, you can say the average impact of AI over the last 3 years, so this is looking back, is about 0.3% or 0.1% a year. That happens to be the CBO and the government's forecasts. They kind of been right in a sense looking back. So this is not nothing, but this is pretty small. And the big reason is, you know, if I think of my own institution, Stanford, we're using AI massively. It has yet probably to have a massive impact on, you know, productivity. There's a whole series of obstacles and bottlenecks that are slowing it down. What about employment? Looking back over the last 3 years, we basically see no impact at all. So firms are telling us there is no effect on net unemployment. You know, if you look on the right, the point estimate for the average is a very tight 0. So nothing in the last 3 years. Things are going to be very different if I look at forecast looking ahead. So forecast looking ahead, we see really huge numbers. As an economist, these are absolutely massive numbers. So let's focus on the US in light blue. Just under 40% of firms report no impact, 39%. The biggest group report a small impact, and then the 17% reporting a large impact. On the right is the average figure. This is 2.25%. Per year, that is 0.75%. Given baselines about 1%, that is almost doubling productivity growth. That is just an enormous impact. I'm aware it's not Dario Amodi's number, but he has an incentive to claim enormous numbers. But for anyone out there in monetary policy or government deficits or looking at growth, that is absolutely a huge number. That is nothing we have seen in the last 100 years of technology that would have that effect. So I think the impact on productivity is huge. This data has led me to change my views from being slightly techno-pessimist at this point. You know, I feel like that Keynes quote. Keynes has said, you know, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? And I feel like I'm kind of trying to change my mind at this point. Then on employment, the numbers are negative on average. So if you look, American firms, 40% are saying no impact, but there's about 40% that are saying small or large impact on their firms. And there's a smaller group, but about 15% are saying positive impacts. When we ask them, that's primarily from less hiring. If you go to the right, look in the US, that's 1.2% less hiring in existing firms. There are 180 million working Americans. That's about 2 million less employees. Now, there is a huge caveat on this, which is this is for existing firms. That does not mean there's less employment, because there's lots of potentially startups and new companies coming out there. But what it does mean is for all the existing companies out there, on average, they are seeing quite substantial reductions in employment from AI. Finally, we asked individuals. So we surveyed 3,000 employees, not necessarily the same firms, but across the US, about the same things. What do they say? Well, on the left, employees are using it about as much as the bosses. So perhaps unsurprisingly, they're 1.8 hours. The bosses in the US are 1.7 hours. On the right, there's a big difference on the impacts on employment and productivity. So employees are positive. Employees are saying on average it will increase productivity, but they're a lot less optimistic, increase employment, but they're a lot less optimistic on productivity. You remember the bosses were 2.25%, employees are 0.9. So what is going on? Well, there's two different stories here. One story is employees know best. Like bosses have drunk the Kool-Aid, they're being beaten up. I hear this all the time from the directors and investors, and they're just, they've had seeing AI everywhere in their sleep, who knows where else. And at that point, they're just predicting very positive numbers, and employees are realistic. There is a different story, and I, to be honest, probably have more faith in the other story, which is, although there's probably some way on both, employees probably don't see the full picture. I've talked to a bunch of execs, and one the other day was telling me, one of my friends saying, look, when I talk to my employees, they talk about AI is going to improve my task and make this activity faster and that quicker, et cetera, et cetera. But when I think about it, I think, am I just going to get rid of that employee or reshape that entire division? And so execs just see the bigger, longer run picture. So I suspect execs are probably more correct, but there is a clear misalignment here across society. So finally, to end, there is just a massive impact. I started my undergrad degree in the early 90s. I've never seen anything like this. I've genuinely changed my mind. I think it is going to push up growth in a very material way. The adoption rates are like no technology I've ever seen, and I've lived through, many people here have lived through some other huge technologies. When I started work, no one used email, and this has come in and the internet. It has big impacts on existing firms and labor markets. I'm much more positive. I should say we're going to rerun these surveys every 6 months. These numbers are critical for central banks at this point, so they're going to be regularly updating it, and they'll update it. So thanks for listening at this point. Okay.